showing that the defendant, at least at a close range, is a good shot. And BCI recovered 5 cartridge cases matching his gun that are consistent with being shot from that position, inside 217. They found 3 matching his gun on the passenger side of the car, placards 77, 78, and 79, shown in State's Exhibit 273. 1 immediately outside the passenger door, placard 37, shown in State's Exhibit 190. And 1 outside, immediately underneath the driver's side door of 217, placard 74, shown in State's Exhibits 246 and 247. So, 5 shots inside the, from inside the driver's seat of 217. However, we also know that mathematically, a magazine exchange in 217 literally does not add up because of the number of rounds the defendant fired overall. If he had done a magazine exchange in 217, he would not have been able to reach the number of 49 casings that we found. Instead, the evidence shows that the defendant fired 5 times from the driver's seat of 217 and, with the remainder of his original magazine still in his weapon, got out of 217 and ran across to duck behind the back bumper of 238, while shots from other officers continued around him. From his position behind 238, he then had to assess the situation and make a decision about what to do next. Your Honor, the defendant is at a critical point in his decision-making. He is behind zone car 238, where he decides to reload his weapon. Timothy Russell and Malissa Williams are trapped. They are contained. They're not going anywhere. They are surrounded by police officers. There were 22 police officers in this area surrounding that Malibu. Not only was the door of the Malibu held closed by a C-clamp, but the passenger side was also wedged up against zone car 238 at this time. There was only one way out of that Malibu. There were police officers to the right of the hill. There was a school exercise area to the left. There were police officers in zone cars to the back. 217 was directly to the Malibu's front left. And we also know from testimony that Officer Simbolic and Officer Farley had a vehicle parked directly up front as well. Your Honor, we also know that down Terrace Road there were a number of police cars. We heard the police cars parked directly across on Lee Road as well. There was no escape for Timothy and Malissa Williams at this time. It was impossible. We also heard from lighting expert, James Binya, and he talked to us a little bit about the light at the scene of Heritage Middle School. He talked about the overhead lighting and how they were white halogen lights. Now that's different than the lights that we normally see on regular streets. They have the yellowish lighting. Right up on Lee Road, there's actually yellow street light. He talked about how he was shocked when he came to that schoolyard to see that there was such good lighting. Not only was there lighting directly over the area where the Malibu was, we know that there was lighting from 217 coming toward the Malibu. We know that there was lighting from the headlights from Simbolic and Farley's vehicle coming toward the Malibu. We also know that the overhead lights provided extra illumination of the occupants in the Malibu. We know that officers had no problem seeing into that vehicle. And we also know from Defendant Brelo's own words to BCI that he was able to see Timothy and Malissa Williams in that Malibu. This decision, this crucial moment, is so important because we have expectations when it comes to officers. Your Honor, it's undisputed that the citizens of Cuyahoga County, as well as our legal system, expect police officers to conduct themselves with some of the highest standards. The community expects police officers to protect them, and they expect police officers to interact with the diverse citizens, and yes, sometimes that includes having to arrest them. And we learned that Timothy Russell and Malissa Williams, they were a part of that diverse community. You heard testimony that they suffered from mental illness. You also heard from family that they were loved. Your Honor, Timothy Russell made some bad decisions that night, but it should not have been a death sentence for him. Our legal system recognizes that there is such a high ethical expectation that when an officer commits a crime, they're not analyzed under the reasonable person standard, but instead their actions are compared to that of a reasonable police officer. Reasonableness must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable police officer in light of all the facts and circumstances confronting the officer at the time and in the moments before the use of deadly force, rather than with a 20/20 vision of hindsight. And we heard that a lot in the State versus White case, which we discussed throughout this trial. You heard how this chase began, and you heard how Defendant Brelo ended up behind zone car 238. He is expected to conduct himself as a reasonable police officer. And Your Honor, the facts of this case have shown that he did anything but that on November 29, 2012. This case that we've been here for over the past 4 weeks weighs heavily on Defendant Brelo's unreasonable use of force on November 29, 2012. Defendant Brelo was to follow a force continuum in which, if he felt that Timothy Russell and Malissa Williams were a threat, the goal should have been to neutralize that threat, not eliminate it. We heard from expert Ken Sars, who has been a law enforcement officer for years, and to this day he still trains law enforcement officers. He told us that officers should give verbal commands that they are indeed contained, which Timothy and Malissa were, that they should show their hands, and that they should give up. He also told us that one way to get compliance is not only by shooting, because shooting is the last resort. If you can get compliance and get them to stop by realizing they now are surrounded, they are contained, that's exactly what you should do. And that analysis comes every second. He also said you may have a severe and ongoing deadly threat that is there. However, you only act with deadly force to a position of neutralizing the threat. Once the individual is contained, once the individual or individuals can't move any further, once they are surrounded, that's when you keep your cover and give commands. And you're not looking now to eliminate the individuals by any means. Defendant Brelo did not do that. Instead, he made the conscious decision to reload behind 238 and the unreasonable decision to jump on the trunk of 238, go up to the light bar of 238, and shoot Timothy and Malissa. Now, he says he perceived a threat when he was at the bumper. And since we cannot look into the mind of others, knowledge is determined from all the acts and exhibits and evidence. His actions showed that at that moment, his intent was to kill. He was knowingly trying to cause the death of Timothy and Malissa. A person acts knowingly, regardless of his purpose, when he is aware that his conduct will probably cause a certain result. A person has knowledge of the circumstances when he is aware that such circumstances probably exist. Since you cannot look into the mind of another, knowledge is determined from all the facts and circumstances in evidence. You would determine from these facts and circumstances whether there existed at the time in the mind of the defendant an awareness of the probability that a shooting would cause death. Defendant Brelo's actions were contrary to any police training that he has ever received. And this is important because training dictates how an officer is to behave when he is faced with what he deems to be a life-threatening event. Ken Casares also told us that the training for officers who are facing a deadly encounter is not to expose yourself to being further injured or killed as a result of a containment that has already taken place, even if there are shots being fired. He also said that is why we train, so that when there is fear or adrenaline, they revert to what they know is proper course of conduct. It is to kick in when they have that moment of fear and or threat assessment, to do it according to the objective assessment, to do it according to the objective analysis of what is proper and what other officers would have done under similar circumstances. Your Honor, jumping on the trunk of Zone Car 238 like Defendant Brelo did is unheard of and it's unreasonable. When asked, Ken Casares says, "No, I have never heard of it. And I believe it's because it would not be objectively reasonable. It would be putting your life in jeopardy and the lives of other officers at risk who would have to try and save your life. They must act objectively, irrespective of their subjective belief at the time. The training guides the objective standard. The objective standard is the training." Defendant's own use of force expert, Ron Martinelli, told this court, "I trained them actually to try and avoid placing yourself in extreme danger." Timothy Russell and Malissa Williams were still alive when Defendant Brelo got on the Zone Car trunk of 238 and when he jumped off of that trunk of 238 and onto the hood of that Malibu. Defendant Brelo's own statement after the shooting from 238, he says, "I was thinking, why are they still moving?" He jumps onto the hood of Timothy's Malibu, he reloads his weapon, and he fires his last 15 shots into their bodies, essentially using them for target practice. Defense's use of force expert Ron Martinelli told this court, he does not train people to jump on hoods and shoot into windshields. There are no police tactics that he knows of somebody standing on top of a hood shooting. We also heard from training officer Brandon Coote. He said he has never seen any police officer jump on a hood to shoot. And if he had, he said it would be memorable. Now, during the BCI investigation, and even further back at the schoolyard, none of the officers told the East Cleveland detective Holcomb, who testified, that they saw Officer Brelo on the hood of the Malibu or on the trunk of the Zone Car 238. BCI, doing their investigation, had some scientific work done, and it was at that point around December 4th that they learned somebody had stood on the hood of that Malibu. Your Honor, one of the main reasons that we are here discussing this today is because rookie officer Brian Simbolic had the moral strength and the courage to tell the truth. He told the truth to BCI when he was interviewed on December 5th of 2012, and he has taken that stand and he's told the court the truth when he testified. Officer Simbolic has stood in that truth for 2.5 years. He explained to the court that he was approximately 40 to 50 feet away from the Malibu and he was aiming at the driver. He stopped shooting because, quote, "I didn't want to hit that person who was on the hood of the car." Brelo told Simbolic that he was on the hood. Early morning of November 30th at the Union Hall, you heard Officer Simbolic tell this court that Brelo told him words to the effect of, I don't recall the exact words, but he said it was more or less to the effect that I was the one that jumped on the hood of the car. He explained to this court that Defendant Brelo had 2 hands and that he was pointing down into the windshield of that Malibu and that he was shooting. He also explained to the court that at some point in time, he and his training officer, Farley, had disagreements about what had actually taken place, what he had seen. He said that Farley claims that Simbolic must have saw Defendant Brelo on the trunk of his own car. Simbolic sat here and he told you no, that he told Farley that he had seen Defendant Brelo on the hood of the Malibu shooting. And then when asked the question, when he was on that stand, whether or not he was right or whether Farley was right, Simbolic responded, "We found out we were both right." Defendant Brelo had been on the hood of his own car shooting, and he had been on, the trunk of his own car shooting, and he had been on the hood of that Malibu shooting, Timothy and Melissa. We also heard from Mark Ketterer. Mark Ketterer was somebody who Defendant Brelo looked up to, somebody who Defendant Brelo confided in. Lieutenant Ketterer told his court that he was concerned he had found out that Defendant Brelo had been in the shooting, that Defendant Brelo called him the afternoon of November 30th, and he told Lieutenant Ketterer that he was up on the hood of the car, and he also described it as saying that it was like being back in war. You also heard from forensic scientist Ted Manasian. And Ted Manasian talked to us about how he did the analysis from the standards that were taken from Defendant Brelo's shoes, compared them to the print that was lifted from the hood of the Malibu, and he said to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that those were indeed Defendant Brelo's footprints on the hood of that Malibu. Mr. Manasian described this to us, Defendant Brelo's boot prints from that night, from his boot being placed onto 2 folders and being provided to Mr. Manasian. We also talked about detail or characteristics that can be pointed out in these boots. And one of the details is this V, or N, depending on how you're looking at it, pattern in the heel of Defendant Brelo's shoe. We also talked about how he saw that print and saw the grooves and was certain that those were Defendant Brelo's footprints. We also introduced photos into the court, into evidence, of Zone Card 238. You heard the testimony, Your Honor, about Defendant Brelo being on the trunk of the car, going up shooting to the light bar, and there's also a shoe print with those same characteristics on the hood of 238. determining shooting and who was shooting last, we heard from an audio that was provided from a Bracknell police cruiser. There was a 5.5-second gap in that audio. During that time, there was no flying glass or shots whizzing by or bullets penetrating the Malibu's windshield that Defendant Brelo could have perceived as coming from the Malibu or any other reason for Defendant Brelo to think that the occupants of the Malibu were still firing. At the end of the police chase, Officer Stephen Barczyk told the court that he arrived on scene. He parked his car on Lee Road. He had a dash cam with the audio recording. The mic was open. And we heard from that audio recording that there were 2 volleys of shots. He had audio experts review the digital audio recording. And at least 15 of the last 18 sounds of gunfire are coming from one shooter, from one gun, in one location. We heard from audio expert Robert Maher, and he said there were 15 gunshots that appear to have come from the same firearm and the same shooter. He said, I am not able to draw that firm scientific conclusion from the analysis of those particular shots, referring to shots 4 through 6. Additional 3 shots, if the orientation of the gun changes, if the barrel is pointing in a different direction for those shots, 4, 5, and 6, than it was for the other shots, for instance, if it's pointing toward the hillside, it could result in an audible reflection. Play it one more time. Audio expert Bruce Koenig stated, I found there were 15 recorded gunshot sounds, and they were consistent with the same individual firing the same weapon in the same general direction and location with similar and the same ammunition. Stephen Beck testified, 15 of the 18 had a very consistent echoes. And what that means is that is a very strong indicator that they fired from one location and that the energy propagated somewhere in front of it, hit a solid object and reflected back, and they were recorded somewhere after the main event. Your Honor, the sound experts corroborate that Defendant Brelo was shooting after the stop in action. In addition to the defendant's own statement, we also know that Timothy and Melissa were still alive when Defendant Brelo fired his last 15 shots from the testimony of the medical examiners, Dr. Philo and Dr. Weems. They told us that the lethal, fatal, center mass wounds were wounds that all the doctors agreed on. They were all downward, they were all hemorrhagic. Timothy Russell, a total of 23 bullets. Malissa Williams was shot 24 times. These are downward, alive, and fatal. 15 downward trajectories, wounds 1, 2, 6, 7, 8, 11, 15A, 15B, 15C, 15D, 15E, 15F, 15H, and 15I. Timothy Russell also had 11 antemortem wounds. He was alive. Wounds 1, 2, 6, 15B, 15C, 15D, 15E, 15F, 15G, 15H, 15I. 11 fatal wounds. Wounds 1, 2, 6, 15B, 15C, 15E, 15F, 15G, 15H, and 15I. And with Malissa Williams, there were 13 downward trajectories, wounds 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and also 8 perforating wounds. There were 6 antemortem wounds alive. Wounds 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 6 fatal wounds. Wounds 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, which was labeled an upward trajectory, but likely shifted when the body was placed in an anatomical position. Dr. Philo has 17 years experience here in Cuyahoga County. He oversaw the training of the residents, and that included Dr. Williams at the time. Dr. Philo also reviewed the bodies and the wounds. A review of those wounds on the bodies by Dr. Philo and Dr. Williams show a shooter is up and above Timothy Russell and Malissa Williams, shooting from an upward position down. And Your Honor, we know that Defendant Brelo is a decent shot. He was only feet away. He also had a good grouping in the windshield of 217 when he shot out. We also know that he had a good grouping when he stood on the hood of the Malibu and transitioned from shooting in Timothy's body and shooting in Melissa's body. And when asked of defense expert Mr. Martini, would you expect a person to hit their target when they are this close to the vehicle? He stated that would be relatively easy to hit your target. Your Honor, cops are trained to shoot center mass. There is also a good grouping on Malissa Williams and Timothy Russell's body. We saw from their clothing the various areas with shots. There was testimony about what those yellow labels meant. There was testimony about each article of clothing that both Timothy Russell and Malissa Williams wore. And the defects in the clothing are also useful to explain the positioning of the bodies at the time of being shot. There's no justification for shooting downward, ending Timothy and Melissa's life. If there is a use of force used, it should have only been used to neutralize them. You don't shoot them just because they are moving. Moving is not a reason to kill someone. You don't eliminate them. This evidence goes to intent. The intent, mens rea of voluntary manslaughter, to knowingly cause. Malissa Russell and Timothy Williams were loved. They had family, they had friends that cared about them. And Defendant Brelo knowingly caused their death. We heard testimony from Officer Michael Flanagan, and he told us that he heard someone yell, "Ceasefire." And when he heard that person yell, "Ceasefire," the shots came to a slowdown. He heard someone yell, "Ceasefire" again, and then the shots came to a stop. He described this volley of shots as being like a crescendo in music. The shots and the volume rose, and then it began to taper down. He also told this court that when I got to the bumper of the vehicle, speaking about the Malibu, I remained down in a crouching position. I observed that the passenger's head and shoulders slumped over. They moved in the vehicle. And he yelled out, "The passenger moved." And when he was on that stand, and he was questioned about whether or not his recollection was better back then or better the day he testified in this court, he told this court, "There's only one recollection." Defendant Brelo was carrying a Glock 17. He shot his weapon 49 times. A count indicated that he shot nearly a full clip from 238, an elevated position, and that he shot nearly a full clip from the hood of the Malibu. And after everything was over, after Defendant Brelo fired all of his shots, everybody was talking about it. You heard Officer Hummel testify that initially all of the officers were walking around at the schoolyard when it happened. They were talking to one another. They were checking to make sure that everybody was okay. But he also said that they were talking about what had just taken place in that schoolyard. We also know this from Officer Hummel's text messages. He sent text messages from the schoolyard and early the next day as well. And he told his court that one of the people he texted was Diane Eck. Diane is a dispatcher for the police department, and they have a pretty good relationship. He texts her, "I know, I'm good. I don't think there ever was," referring to a gun. "I am not happy with a lot of things that happen. Some things I can only tell you in person. I am fighting an internal struggle right now for a lot of reasons. What I know will haunt me until I am allowed to say something." He also texts Diane Eck, "Deadly force issues are not what I'm talking about. These fucking cowboys out here could have killed a lot of policemen last night. After going through it all today, I know there never was a gun. Some people have lied to protect themselves, and it's going to come out. I brought up why I knew there was no gun, and I was told to keep my mouth shut by the union." He texts Officer Dave Sieper, and he says Brelo swears he was fired on by the water treatment plant, and that's where his mirror was shot off. That's where we seen and heard the second backfire. I'm pretty sure I seen his mirror next to the car at the school. Going to bed, talk to you tomorrow about it. There was never a gun, and Nan and Almeida heard a backfire. They didn't know. No one knew, but we seen and heard at least 3. No shell casings on St. Clair, and I guarantee no residue on either one in the car. We got lucky we didn't hastily shoot. And he put hot, but I'm assuming he meant get mixed up in this shit. That text saying that Defendant Brelo swears his mirror was shot off at the water treatment plant also confirms that Defendant Brelo was talking about what had taken place that night. Despite what he told BCI officers saying he didn't talk about the incident, he was talking. We know that already from him speaking to Officer Simbolic, and we know that now from Officer Hummel's text message. He sends a text to Diane Eck because the rookie fired a shot on the parking lot when we thought it was over in the back of the parking lot. It was one shot. I seen it, but I was not on the mic. The other parts I have to tell you in person. For what was perceived from the broadcast, no one will be faulted for shooting. It is the manner of the shooting and the number of rounds fired. I guarantee no one ever seen a gun. Diane Eck replies by saying, heard he shot 3 clips. And then Officer Hummel texts back to Diane Eck, not just how many, but how. Not just how many, but how. We also heard from Officer Mitchell, Detective Mitchell, and he took the stand and he told that he spoke to Brelo at the scene as well. And he asked Defendant Brelo if he had shot his weapon. And he told this court that Defendant Brelo told him that he had shot and that he only had 2 rounds left in his gun magazine. And Your Honor, that's exactly what Defendant Brelo had left. He recalled that night, that detail. 137 bullets fired. There was no gun. There were 13 shooters. 13 people who were taken away, separated at some point in time, and then they all went to the Union Hall, where they talked more. Now, Defendant Brelo gave his statement to BCI investigators on December 10th, 2012, and he was anything but truthful. Defendant Brelo said he couldn't remember what happened after he shot on the trunk of Zone Car 238. The next thing he remembers was taking the keys out and putting them on the hood. Brelo gave his statement 11 days after the shooting. He remembers all of the details before he jumped on the hood and killed Malissa Williams and Timothy Russell. That there were officers all around to my left. He remembered to say, I was terrified of the car ramming us and me being sucked underneath Zone Car 238. And he remembered to say why he got on the trunk of 238, to elevate like he was trained in the military, thinking that this excuse would be enough to overlook his unreasonable behavior of getting on 238. He remembered to say to the investigators that he was thinking, why are they still moving? Why are they still shooting at us? An excuse as to why he had to shoot while on 238. And now the one thing that Defendant Brelo knew he could not attempt to explain away was him getting on the hood of the Malibu and shooting point blank into Timothy and Melissa's body. He knew they were trapped. He knew they were not shooting. And so he stood right up in front of them, exposing his body, and he shot them. And when BCI investigators asked Defendant Brelo about him being on the hood of the Malibu, he suddenly had amnesia. He said, I have no recollection if I did, sir. Absolutely none. Your Honor, we called a number of police officers and a number of witnesses to the stand. The state called a total of 45 witnesses to the stand, 20 of them being police officers, and some of them not testifying and taking the Fifth Amendment. Your Honor, the state has proved the facts of this case beyond a reasonable doubt. Ms. Barnhill covered the portion of the chase, sudden fit of passion, or a sudden fit of rage, which is presumed that there was serious provocation occasioned by the victim that, if reasonably sufficient, could incite the person into using deadly force. We also proved that defendant Brelo knowingly caused the death of Timothy Russell and Malissa Williams. Cause is an act or failure to act, which in a natural and continuous sequence directly produces the physical harm and without which it would not have occurred. Cause occurs when the physical harm is the natural and foreseeable result of the act or failure to act. There may be more than one cause. Your Honor, I think I speak for everyone when I say that we appreciate police officers and we understand the danger that they put their lives in. But I also think that I speak for everyone in the community, everyone in this courtroom, when I say that officers should still be held responsible for their action. And the only way to do that in this case, to hold defendant Brelo responsible for his actions, is to find him guilty.
Thank you, Ms. Royster. Start at 5 after, so we're off again.
No, need it.